Good morning, everyone. Thank you for listening to my paper and thank you to the organizers of this exciting event. My name is Magdalena Zolkos. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Social Justice at the Australian Catholic University. The title of my paper is Arboreal Women and Sexuated Plants, Feral Subjects in the Work of Kang. I work in the area of political and cultural analysis, and one of my interests is in the representation of human relationships with non-human entities, plants, animals, and inanimate objects. This is in regard to illuminating and perhaps critiquing some of the key themes or questions in cultural and political analysis that within the modern paradigm have been cast in entirely anthropocentric terms. For example, just to mention those that have a direct bearing on the paper, the theory of violence, agency, and subjectivity. So I see the task of post-humanist cultural and political theorizing as a way of opening novel ways to think about these themes, about violence, agency, and subjectivity. It is to this task that I hope to contribute with my paper today. In the paper, I use the concept of the feral as an organizing frame. The feral connotes the untamed, wild, non-human animal or a beast, but also anti-hegemonic possibilities of insubordination and resistance. I ask then about the aesthetic and political stakes in representing agency and subjectivity that is needed to expose two kinds of violence: the violence of patriarchy, that ensures male leadership, authority, and privilege in society, and the violence of carnism. Carnism is a term first used by the cultural psychologist Melanie Joy to capture the phenomenon of depicting animal consumption as something natural or normal, which she locates in defense mechanisms that nullify the association between animal death and animal suffering and human cruelty. The primary focus of the paper is on a novella by a South Korean author, Kang. First published in 2007, translated into English by Deborah Smith, it appeared in 2015, winning, among other awards, Man Booker International Prize. The novel tells a story of a young woman, Young-hee. She's in a profound state of crisis, undergoing a psychotic breakdown. The novel starts with her sudden decision to refuse to eat meat. Gradually, she also develops a fantasy of arboreal transformation of her body. In my reading of the novel, I propose that the protagonist as a feral subject, or reading her as a feral subject, only makes sense if we recognize the profound confluence of two modalities of violence that have shaped her life, patriarchy and carnism. Only then, I think, we can appreciate the insight that comes from her representation as a recalcitrant, willful subject that attempts to live a non-violent, non-passive life. My analysis is grounded in so-called vegetal turn in philosophy. The key postulate of philosophic vegetal turn is that the Western metaphysics is indebted to a problematic claim that comes from Aristotle. It is that plants are the simplest life form at the bottom of hierarchical order of organic animate entities, kind of in between animals and things, and that plants and humans are fundamentally different and discontinuous. The vegetal philosophers, among others Luce Irigaray and Michael Marder, have argued that human subjectivity needs to be seen as continuous with, as bearing residues of, and as proximate to the vegetal life, including its capacity for self-possession. What this means for my reading of Kang's novel is that I think it inscribes itself into this sort of larger cultural moment of recasting ethical agency as a kind of continuity, proximity, and connection between humans and the larger vegetal world. The etymology of the English word feral comes via Middle French from Latin fera, commonly used in the expression fera bestia, wild animal, in turn derived from the hypothetical source of the Proto-Indo-European gwer, wild beast. The term is not simply descriptive of animals that are unsuitable for domestication. It also travels across human-non-human divide as a name for those outside civilizing influence of the Roman Empire, barbarians or savages. The modern connotation is not a category descriptor, as much as it connotes an event of refusal to be tamed, to be obedient or docile. Note that it's often used in regard to animals that, as per category, count as domestic, feral cats or feral pigs. It often invokes a sense of danger, of predatory and ferocious behavior. The notion of the feral subject, as I develop it in the paper, invokes that of reverting from, rebelling against, or escaping a domesticated, docile state. In The Vegetarian, we find that one way of interpreting the protagonist's motivation and actions as emergence of the feral subject is by pointing to a motif of escape impulse. With the help of philosophic treatise on escape by Emmanuel Levinas, in the paper I define such escape impulse as a fugitive drive, or what Levinas calls a quest for the way out. It's a human desire to overcome, move beyond, or step over one's physical, social limits. This, in turn, helps me articulate the main argument of the paper, that Yayomi's veganism is a project of radical self-exile from humanity, as well as powerful anti-patriarchal gesture of insubordination and norm defiance. The first part of the book takes the perspective of Yayomi's husband and offers insight into why her decision to abandon meat-based diet becomes such a scandal in the family and society at large. For the husband, Yayomi's choice is incomprehensible. It's what he calls sheer obstinacy. It's a transgression that is also a failure to submit to his patriarchal will, to pleasure him, and to display gratitude. The other characters in the novel, family members and his colleagues, also react to Yayomi with outrage and discomfort. Her veganism functions as a kind of anti-carnist statement. It's an obstinate reminder that their source of sustenance and pleasure derives from deliberate disremembrance of animal suffering. Yayomi's veganism is also interpreted as an onset of psychosis by the husband. It interrupts what he perceives as her entirely passive and ordinary life. The opening line of the novel reads, "Before my wife turned vegetarian, I'd always thought of her as completely unremarkable in every way." That introduces a question that is central to the novel, and in fact to Han Kang's other writings, that of passivity, or living a passive life. Yayomi is perceived by the husband as passive, which for him is synonymous with lack of sexual attraction, which later develops into kind of disgust or repulsion. In fact, it is more apt to describe the husband as a passive character. In the paper, I characterize him as an inversion of Melville's Bartleby. Instead of a decline of opportunity, I would prefer not to, he greets any invitation to act in the novel with indiscriminate acceptance. I don't see the reason why not to. As I've said before, it makes sense to call Yayomi's feral subject if we envision the kind of violence she opposes as a convergence of carnism and patriarchy. In the novel, that is manifest in the shared logic of the violent attacks on her body in response to her veganism. The husband rapes her, and the father forcefully inserts meat into her mouth. What binds these violent acts is their disciplinary and pedagogic intention. They are meant to ensure Yayomi compliance. They are meant to teach her gratitude. However, Yayomi responds to their rape with a powerful resistance and animal-like rage. And after the father forces a piece of meat into her mouth, she tries to harm and kill herself. The source of Yayomi's refusal to eat meat lies in dreams and vision. The recurrent motif is a violently penetrated body, such as a dog's sliced throat or a pierced, bleeding animal eyes. For Yong-hee, her own body is an instrument of violence, and it's the practice of meat-eating, the animal's violent incorporation within oneself, that serves as a reminder of her complicity with the non-human suffering. However, it also offers her an opportunity of a kind of purging, maybe even redemption. She says, for instance, the following about her breasts. The breasts are an important organ in the novel because of the sort of non-violent nurturing associations, but also because of her refusal to constrain them with a bra. She says, "I like my breasts. Nothing can be killed by them. Hand, foot, tongue, gaze, all weapons from which nothing is safe, but not my breasts." She then describes the physical sensations of pain and compression due to meat eating in the following quote. "The thing that hurts is my chest. Something is stuck in my solar plexus. I don't know what it might be. It is lodged there permanently. Even though I've stopped wearing a bra, I can feel the slump all the time. No matter how deeply I inhale, it doesn't go away. Yells and howls, threaded together layer upon layer, are enmeshed to form that lump. Because of meat. Because I ate too much meat. The lives of the animals I ate have all lodged there. Blood and flesh, all those butchered bodies are scattered in every nook and cranny, and though the physical remnants were excreted, their lives still stick stubbornly to my insides." Yong-hee experiences her body then as bearing indelible traces of animal deaths and suffering. In spite of her veganism and later abstention from any food, she admits the impossibility of innocence in the face of violence. Experiencing a psychotic breakdown, she's found clenching a bird to death with her hand. What follows in the novel is an attempted transformation into a tree. Through that sort of arboreal metamorphosis, Yong-hee considers the cutaneous surface as a locality of valuable experience, of receptivity, and ecological co-entanglement. She repetitively removes clothing and exposes her skin to the sun. Yong-hee, as a figure of plasticity, of vegetal metamorphosis, experiences her human desire and her vegetal proclivities as related and continuous. The second part of the novel introduces the narrative perspective of Yong-hee's brother-in-law, performance artist. The key event in that part is Yong-hee's participation in the artist installation where he paints her body with lustrous flowers. The artist becomes obsessed with Yong-hee's androgynous and malnourished body precisely because of its arboreal, floral appearance. His sexual interest attaches itself to an object on Yong-hee's skin, a concentration of pigment called the Mongolian mark on her buttocks. The dark green mark appears to the artist as, I quote, "a blue flower, its petals opening outwards." It is thus a sign of form plasticity. While the artist displays some understanding for Yong-hee's resistance against violence and for her motivations and actions, his narcissistic attitude towards his art means that ultimately he remains complicit with the objectification of her body. Yong-hee participates in the artist's installation and he paints her body with lustrous flowers. It appears that her vegetal transformation and her departure or escape impulse from humanity has become more advanced. She is captivated by the blossoms on her skin and vows not to wash them off, but to the artist's surprise, she also appears entirely devoid of human sexual excitation. What the artist sees as Yong-hee's passivity and lack of vitality is here, I think, a continuation of her defiance against violence, in this case, the objectification of sexual gaze. This defiance is perhaps best described as a quality of self-possession. Kang weaves here the idea of passivity into the construction of her character, with important theoretical nuance. At hand is a feral subject that opposes oppressive structures. Their violence is both physical and epistemic and affirms her own dignity through that act, but she does not follow a ready-made script of resistance. Yong-hee repudiates She's a feral subject in the sense of ceaselessly and actively seeking to separate herself from oppressive forces, even if ultimately she fails to occupy the position of nonviolence. Yonki's description as self-possessed and self-contained are thus really important here, but they're not part of the lexicon of the autonomous subject. Rather, they are a marker of dignified life. The third part of the novel is narrated by Yonki's sister, In-hee. Yonki is now a patient in a psychiatric institution. In-hee is the only family member who visits and cares for her and who pays the medical bills. Yonki's abstention from meat eating has evolved into a silent state of vegetation, and one of its signs is a slow disappearance of language. The sisters' relationship can be idiomatized as Lucy Irigary's touch. In Ying-hee's seemingly mundane gestures, the older sister practices a non-possessive attitude of affection, gentleness and hospitality towards her sister. Yonki is not for her an object of repulsion or pity or desire. Instead, In-hee recognizes her younger sister as a dignified and willful in living life according to her own intention. Their relationship is the closest Han Kang makes an affirmative representation of nonviolence in the novel, even though it occurs in the violence-saturated context of Yong-hee's hospitalization. Yong-hee awakens in her older sister a longing to escape social expectations and defy norms, and she provides a kind of psychic mirror through which In-hee realizes her own formative relation to violence. Complicity and submission are contrasted with self-possession. The subject's claim on and a sense of ownership of her emotions, desires, and proclivities. It is notable that In-hee feels that her life, I quote, had never belonged to her, and she describes it as another quote, a ghostly pageant of exhausted endurance. She's undergoing hardship and complies with social norm without staging any opposition. In-hee's practice of fidelity and care towards her sister means that, I quote, she can't bring herself to abandon Yong-hee. In-hee's obligation towards her sister lies thus beyond social obligations and expectations, and in fact, In-hee remains with her sister even when this means that she needs to abandon her own child. Following demands of that hyperbolic fidelity, In-hee forcefully prevents the sister's tube feeding and remains with her in what appears to be Yong-hee's final moments. The two undertake something akin to an escape. In the final paragraph, In-hee witnesses trees blazing with green fire, at which, I quote, she stares in fiercely, the look in her eyes dark and insistent. That might mean perhaps her own psychic decline, or more hopefully, a moment of defiance and the breaking of passive life. Let me conclude. In that paper, I have used the concept of the feral subject as a kind of conceptual optics onto a protest against the intersecting violence of patriarchy and carnism. Through the prism of the concept, the protagonist appears as a sort of willful, stubborn subject who is engaged in a desperate attempt to live a non-violent and non-passive life. Yong-hee goes wild from her domesticated condition of a submissive wife and daughter. The killed and consumed animals haunt the humans through a series of feral gestures in their dreams and visions, and the uncontrollable plants colonize human bodies, skins, and psyches. What I hope the paper has achieved, then, is to show that Han Kang's The Vegetarian is a rich source of ideas for thinking about agential recalcitrance or willfulness of feral nature that refuses to take its proper place within the separatist and carnist order, insisting instead on the plasticity of forms and enacting human, vegetal, hybrids and continuities. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.